Viewer advisory. The events you are about to witness are based on a true story. Some scenes may be deeply unsettling for certain audiences. Viewer discretion is strongly recommended. The courthouse was silent except for the rhythmic tap of the judge's pen against mahogany. Evelyn Carter sat motionless in the defendant's chair, her weathered hands folded in her lap, dignity intact despite the shackles around her wrists. At 70 years old, she faced life in prison for a crime that defied everything anyone who truly knew her would believe. The prosecution painted her as a desperate woman with nothing left to lose, a narrative that seemed to stick in this small Alabama town where whispers carried more weight than evidence. But what they didn't know was that somewhere across the country, three men who owed everything to this woman were about to turn the world upside down to save her. Tonight's story is one that will leave you rattled. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe, give this video a like, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. Now, let's begin. 25 years earlier, on a rain-soaked October morning that seemed to weep for the forgotten, Evelyn Carter discovered what would become the greatest purpose of her life. She had been widowed for 2 years, her husband claimed by cancer that ravaged their savings as thoroughly as it destroyed his body. At 45, she lived alone in a small white house on Elm Street, its paint peeling like old skin, its porch groaning under the weight of too many storms. Evelyn worked the early shift at Murphy's Diner, washing dishes in scalding water that left her hands red and raw. She was the kind of woman who moved through life quietly, leaving plates of leftover biscuits on her back step for stray cats and homeless veterans, slipping dollar bills into collection plates even when her own cupboards ran bare. Her faith was as steady as her heartbeat, and both had been tested more than most could endure. That morning, as she stepped onto her porch to retrieve the newspaper, she froze. Huddled against her garbage bins like discarded dolls sat three boys, their small bodies pressed together under a blanket so tattered it barely qualified as fabric. The oldest might have been 11, his protective arm wrapped around two smaller figures who shivered in the damp Alabama air. They were barefoot, soaked through, and their eyes held a hollow emptiness that spoke of nights too cold and days too hungry. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She didn't ask where they came from or why they were there. She simply opened her door wider and asked, "When did you last eat?" The boys followed her inside like wounded animals, cautious but desperate. The oldest, who would tell her his name was Caleb, kept his younger brothers behind him, his small fists clenched and ready to spite his exhaustion. Drew, around 9, had eyes that darted to every exit, calculating escape routes even as his stomach growled audibly. And Jamie, barely 6 years old, sucked his thumb and hadn't spoken a word in so long that Caleb wasn't sure he remembered how. They were brothers by blood and bound by survival, their past a patchwork of failed foster placements, absent parents, and a system that had given up on them long before they gave up on it. Their mother had vanished into the haze of addiction. Their father was a ghost who existed only in court documents. Child Protective Services had lost track of them months ago, and the streets had become their only constant companion. But Evelyn saw beyond their circumstances. She saw children who needed more than temporary shelter. They needed someone to believe they were worth saving. Without ceremony, she gave up her bedroom so the three boys could share the warmest room in the house. She stretched soup with water to make it last, crafted shoes from thrift store scraps, and somehow made magic from nothing. The neighbors whispered, of course they did. In 1998 Alabama, a black woman raising three white boys raised eyebrows and uncomfortable questions. Why is she keeping those white boys? They'd mutter behind church pews and over backyard fences. But Evelyn held her head high and answered anyone brave enough to ask directly. Children don't choose their skin color. They just need someone to love them right. The early years were a symphony of chaos and growth. Caleb got into fights defending his brothers and his new mother, his knuckles frequently bloodied from confrontations with kids who didn't understand their unusual family. Drew developed a habit of taking things, small items from stores, money from coat pockets, his survival instincts too strong to trust that food and safety would always be there. And Jamie remained largely silent, but he followed Evelyn everywhere, mimicking her humming and eventually sitting beside her during Sunday morning scripture readings, his small finger following along as she read aloud. One sweltering summer evening, when Caleb was 14, he came home with blood on his shirt and fire at his eyes. A man outside the grocery store had called Evelyn a slur, questioning why she thought she could raise white children. Caleb's response had been swift and decisive. Evelyn didn't scold him as she cleaned his wounds. Instead, she held a cool rag to his knuckles and whispered, "Hate is loud, baby, but love fights louder." As the boys grew into teenagers, Evelyn's health began to fail. Diabetes crept in like a thief, followed by arthritis that made simple tasks monumental challenges. Her shifts at the diner became shorter, her paycheck smaller, but somehow they always found a way. All three boys took jobs, Caleb at a garage, Drew at a grocery store, Jamie tutoring younger kids. They wouldn't let their mother lift a finger more than necessary. By the time Jamie turned 18, the impossible had happened. The quiet boy who had arrived, unable to speak, had earned a full scholarship to Auburn University. He was going to study law. He announced one evening over Evelyn's cornbread because he wanted to help people who couldn't help themselves. Evelyn cried that night, alone in her room, overwhelmed by pride and the bittersweet knowledge that her baby bird was ready to fly. One by one, they left to build the lives she had taught them they deserved. Caleb enlisted in the Army, his protective instincts finding purpose in service. Drew moved to Chicago, his street-smart survival skills transforming into business acumen. And Jamie, her quiet miracle, graduated law school and established himself as a criminal defense attorney in Birmingham, specializing in cases where the system had failed its most vulnerable citizens. They called when they could, sent money when they had it, but life pulled them in different directions. Evelyn understood. She had raised them to soar, not to stay tethered to her modest porch. She was 70 and slowing down, her diabetes requiring daily medication that ate up most of her small Social Security check. But she had no regrets. Those boys had given her purpose when she thought her story was over. Then came the day that changed everything. Evelyn had walked to Corner Pharmacy to pick up her insulin, the same routine she'd maintained for years. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as she waited in line behind just one other customer, a well-dressed white man in his 50s who seemed agitated, checking his phone repeatedly and shifting from foot to foot. She recognized him as Richard Thornfield, a prominent local businessman whose family owned half the commercial real estate in town. As Evelyn paid for her medication, she heard a commotion outside. Through the pharmacy window, she watched Thornfield collapse on the sidewalk, convulsing violently before going still. She rushed outside with others, her heart racing as paramedics arrived and declared him dead at the scene. The investigation that followed was swift and merciless. The medical examiner found fentanyl in Thornfield's system, a lethal dose that had stopped his heart within minutes. Security footage from the pharmacy showed only two people near him in his final moments, Evelyn and the pharmacist. A pill bottle was missing from Thornfield's prescription bag, though he had been prescribed only blood pressure medication. For Detective Ray Morrison, a 20-year veteran with a reputation for quick closures, the case seemed straightforward. A poor elderly black woman, a wealthy white businessman dead from drug overdose, an opportunity captured on grainy surveillance footage. The narrative wrote itself. Evelyn had somehow slipped him the fatal dose, probably trying to rob him and accidentally killing him in the process. The arrest came at dawn, patrol cars flooding Elm Street like an invasion force. Neighbors peered from windows as Evelyn was led away in handcuffs, her dignity intact even as her world crumbled. The local news picked up the story with sensational headlines. Elderly woman charged in businessman's death and deadly encounter at local pharmacy. The trial was a foregone conclusion in many minds before it even began. Evelyn's court-appointed attorney, fresh out of law school and overwhelmed by his caseload, barely mounted a defense. He seemed more interested in negotiating a plea deal than fighting for his client's innocence. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Patricia Henley, a woman with political ambitions and an impressive conviction rate, painted Evelyn as a desperate criminal who had finally been caught. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Henley declared in her opening statement, "the defendant is a woman with nothing left to lose. Facing poverty, illness, and isolation, she made a choice that cost an innocent man his life. The evidence is clear, the timeline undeniable. Justice demands accountability." Day after day, Evelyn sat in that courtroom listening to character assassinations and circumstantial evidence presented as fact. No one mentioned her decades of quiet service to her community. No one spoke of the 3 boys she had saved from the streets and raised into good men. The woman who had stretched every dollar to feed hungry mouths was portrayed as a thief and a killer. Her sons tried to reach her. Caleb requested emergency leave from his deployment in Germany, but was denied. Drew flew down from Chicago, but was turned away from the jail. Only immediate family allowed, and adoption papers from decades past were buried in bureaucratic red tape. Jamie drove down from Birmingham repeatedly, but each time was told the same thing. His mother wasn't accepting visitors. The truth was, Evelyn had refused to see them. In her mind, she was protecting them from the shame and scrutiny that would come from being associated with her case. She would bear this cross alone rather than let it touch the lives she had worked so hard to build for them. The guilty verdict came on a humid Thursday afternoon in June. The jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with their decision. As the foreman read the words, "Guilty on all charges," Evelyn closed her eyes and whispered a prayer not for herself, but for her boys. "Lord, if this is my time, hold my sons wherever they are." Sentencing was scheduled for the following Monday. In Alabama, the murder charge carried the possibility of life in prison without parole or even death. At 70 years old, either sentence was effectively the same. Evelyn spent the weekend in her cell, reading her worn Bible and preparing to meet whatever fate awaited her. Monday morning arrived gray and oppressive, the courthouse steps already crowded with reporters and curious onlookers. Evelyn was led into the courtroom in shackles, her head held high despite everything. Judge Harold Brennan, a stern man in his 60s known for harsh sentences, reviewed the pre-sentencing report with theatrical gravity. "Mrs. Carter," he began, his voice echoing in the packed courtroom, "you have been found guilty of murder in the first degree. Before I impose sentence, do you have anything to say?" Evelyn stood slowly, her arthritic joints protesting. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and strong, "I did not kill that man. I've never hurt anyone in my life. But I understand that sometimes the truth gets lost in the noise. I just want my boys to know that I love them, and I hope they remember me as someone who tried to do right." Judge Brennan nodded curtly and lifted his gavel. "Given the severity of this crime and the impact on the victim's family, I hereby sentence you to—" "Your Honor, if I may." The voice cut through the courtroom like lightning, causing heads to turn and murmurs to ripple through the gallery. A tall man in an impeccably tailored navy suit strode down the center aisle, his presence commanding immediate attention. He was in his early 30s, with kind eyes that burned with barely contained fury and determination. "I'm Jamie Carter," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "And she didn't do this. She couldn't." Judge Brennan frowned, his gavel frozen in midair. "Sir, this is highly irregular. Who are you to interrupt these proceedings?" Jamie stepped closer to the bench, his eyes never leaving the judge's face. "I'm the boy she saved from dying in an alley 25 years ago. I'm the one she taught to read when teachers said I was too damaged to learn. I'm the son she didn't birth, but raised with everything she had at her heart. In your honor, I have proof that will exonerate her completely." The courtroom erupted in shocked whispers. District Attorney Henley jumped to her feet, objecting loudly, but Judge Brennan raised his hand for silence. Something in Jamie's bearing, the quiet confidence and legal precision of his words, commanded attention. "I'm a criminal defense attorney. Your Honor," Jamie continued, producing his bar card. "I've spent the last week investigating this case that should have been investigated properly from the beginning. What I found will shock this court and this community." From his briefcase, Jamie withdrew a small digital device. "This is a flash drive containing security footage from Thornfield Industries' corporate office building, which sits directly across from the pharmacy. Their cameras are higher resolution than the pharmacy system, and they captured something everyone missed. Judge Brennan looked skeptical but intrigued. Approached the bench, counselor. As Jamie walked forward, Evelyn's eyes filled with tears for the first time since her arrest. Her baby, her quiet Jamie who had arrived unable to speak, was now commanding a courtroom with the power of his voice and the strength of his conviction. The footage was damning and definitive. The high-resolution cameras had captured everything. Richard Thornfield's nephew, Marcus Thornfield, approaching his uncle outside the pharmacy. The younger man could be seen slipping something into his uncle's coffee cup, while the older man was distracted by his phone. The timestamp showed this happening 3 minutes before Evelyn ever approached the building. But there was more. Jamie had spent the week doing what the police should have done, investigating. Marcus Thornfield was deeply in debt from gambling and cocaine addiction. He stood to inherit his uncle's entire estate, worth over $10 million. Phone records showed he had been in contact with a known drug dealer the day before his uncle's death. Bank records revealed he had withdrawn $10,000 in cash that same week. "Your Honor," Jamie said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, "my mother was convicted because she was an easy target. A poor black woman with no resources to fight back. But the real killer is sitting in this courtroom right now." Marcus Thornfield, who had been sitting in the gallery throughout the trial as a grieving family member, bolted for the exit. He didn't make it far. Court officers were already moving to intercept him based on Jamie's evidence. The courtroom descended into chaos. Reporters shouted questions. Spectators gasped and pointed. Judge Brennan slammed his gavel repeatedly, calling for order. Through it all, Evelyn sat motionless, staring at her son with a mixture of pride, disbelief, and overwhelming love. The recess lasted 2 hours while authorities verified Jamie's evidence. When court reconvened, District Attorney Henley stood with visible reluctance and spoke words that came out like broken glass. "Your Honor, in light of new evidence, the state moves to dismiss all charges against Evelyn Carter." The acquittal was immediate and complete. As the shackles were removed from her wrists, Evelyn finally allowed herself to cry. Jamie ran to her, this successful attorney reducing himself to the 6-year-old boy who had once needed her protection, falling to his knees beside her chair and taking her weathered hands in his. "You didn't think I forgot, did you, Mama?" he whispered, using the name he hadn't spoken in years. That evening, as news vans lined Elm Street and reporters sought interviews, a different kind of reunion was taking place on Evelyn's front porch. Drew had flown in from Chicago the moment he heard the news, leaving his corporate job without a second thought. Caleb had somehow managed emergency leave and arrived still in his dress uniform, his medals glinting in the porch light. They sat around her kitchen table like they had 20 years earlier, 3 grown men who still felt like boys when their mother put cornbread in front of them. They talked about everything and nothing, filling the years of silence with laughter and tears and the kind of love that doesn't diminish with time or distance. As the evening wound down, Jamie stepped onto the porch for air, needing a moment to process the whirlwind of the day. Evelyn followed him, her arthritis protesting but her spirit soaring. She leaned against the railing where she had watched them play as children, where she had worried through their teenage years, where she had cried when they left home. "You saved my life today, Jamie," she said softly. He turned to her, this woman who had been both mother and father, teacher and protector, the foundation upon which everything good in his life had been built. "No, Mama," he replied. "You gave me mine. I just gave a little back." In the weeks that followed, the real story emerged. Marcus Thornfield pleaded guilty to murder in the 2nd degree rather than face a trial where his uncle's drug addiction and his own desperate financial situation would be exposed publicly. The pharmacy's security system was upgraded. Detective Morrison faced an internal investigation for his shoddy work. District Attorney Henley quietly decided not to run for re-election. But for Evelyn Carter, the headlines and investigations mattered less than the simple miracle of having her family whole again. Drew decided to relocate his business to Alabama to be closer to home. Caleb applied for a transfer to a base within driving distance, and Jamie opened a satellite office in their hometown, specializing in cases where the system had failed the most vulnerable. Sometimes love doesn't arrive in matching skin tones or perfect circumstances. Sometimes it comes in the form of 3 broken boys and a woman with just enough faith to believe they were worth saving. Sometimes justice delayed becomes justice demanded by those who refuse to let innocence be sacrificed on the altar of convenience. And sometimes, just sometimes, a quiet woman's legacy lives on in the voices of those she taught to speak truth to power, even when that power seems insurmountable. The house on Elm Street still stands, its paint fresh now, its porch sturdy and welcoming. 3 successful men still call it home in their hearts, and a 70-year-old woman still leaves food on her back step for anyone who might need it. Because that's what love does. It feeds the hungry, shelters the lost, and never, ever gives up on the possibility of justice. If this story touched your heart and reminded you that love truly has the power to change everything, please hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories of justice, redemption, and the unbreakable bonds that hold families together against all odds. See you in the next video.